As I mentioned to you in my introduction, Mr. Panda is a very active member of the Lok Sabha, a rising star in Indian politics, manages a state which has turned around from what he said, a basket case, to a respectable rate of growth, and the people are much better off. And this Orissa, once they get their international airport going, the connectivity improves. It also becomes an entry point for Southeast Asian visitors to enter eastern border of India. Mr. Panda made a very good speech, made several points. I think I will not start by asking him a question because I'm sure you have a lot of questions. So let me open it to you to ask the questions. And he's a very articulate speaker. We've had him here before. We also sit on this 1.5 track India-Singapore strategic dialogue. We are both members of that. So I've known Mr. Panda for some time and was very impressed by his presentations. So first question, always the more difficult one. Mr. Rai? No. Who's? Oh, sorry. Yes. Please address yourself.
I'm Venki Panchpagesan from Indian Institute of Management, Bangalore. I wanted to carry on one of the points that Mr. Panda mentioned about the consent. And I've been working on some of the land valuation issues. One of the reasons why people are hesitant to provide consent is the fact that they don't know what the value of the asset that they're giving up. And the information is not easily available, and it's largely controlled by a few vested interests. And if you look at the success of the land pooling that has been done in Andhra Pradesh, part of the reason behind that success is the fact that the farmers continue to own the land. So there is an incentive alignment there where they're not giving up the asset when the value is not certain. So I'm wondering whether there is something there to the fact that the consent, rather than trying to hit the consent, if you make the information more easily available, the market will settle itself.
You've touched upon a very valid and important aspect of the consent issue. As I had been mentioning in my talk, the suspicions are all for good reason, for decades of non-transparency. Now, the 2013 Act tried to address the lack of transparency on price by coming up with the formula, as you know, the 4 times, 5 times, etc. Now that's, in my opinion, is a bureaucratic approach to solve the problem. But the real problem is not that superficial. It's much more entrenched. And cracking open the land issue in a manner that pricing becomes, price discovery becomes transparent is easier said than done. That is because land records even today are ambiguous. You have overlapping land record systems running back to the Mughal era that are still followed, the British Raj, modern India, and some of them are not yet computerized. And you continue to have a lot of disputes every time you have even an individual person buying a farmland or a plot for a house or anything, always has enormous uncertainty about the land that she is buying or the value because of those issues. So implementation of the laws in India is a big challenge, and not just for land. Because of the court system backlog, once you get into a dispute, something can get locked up for many, many years. So getting prices transparent is, of course, the right answer. How do you get it done is a much more complex answer, because it's not just one problem you need to fix. You need to fix an issue of governance that spans across the board at the lowest levels where the citizen has to interact with the state.
Yes, can you use the mic, Dr. Ram?
Yeah. My name is Subbarao. I'm a visiting fellow at the university. Thank you very much. I want to compliment you for a very impressive speech. You speak from a lot of study and research and experience. I've heard you and you've covered the entire subject, but I wanted to ask you, what in your opinion are the parameters of an ideal Land Acquisition Act, in particular on consent and compensation?
Thank you, Dr. Rao. Dr. Subbarao, it's a pleasure to have you ask me a question. It's indeed a privilege. I think the root of the answer has to lie in finding a win-win solution. Unless the person who's losing land believes it's actually in his interest to move on, there is always going to be resistance. Now, compensation can take many different aspects. One is the money compensation. One is the assurance of a job to a member of the family. One is alternate arrangements. I want to also add the perspective of how compensation is to be done. You have a problem today in northern India where many farmers have sold their land willingly at very high market prices, and you have a whole generation of people that are driving around fancy cars, not having a job, doing drugs. It's a serious problem that is being discussed in Punjab. The discussion has been that you can't just give them a lump of money. They deserve the money that is due, but it has many other aspects are there. Perhaps it can be an annuity instead of a lump sum, something like a 30-year annuity that allows them a transition. Most importantly, I think, is what I call front-ending. Now, I have written about this repeatedly. For the companies or for the mega public sector infrastructure projects for which land is being acquired, the land component is not a make or break in terms of the economics of the project, usually. So if the land component goes up a little bit, it's not usually going to stop the project in its tracks. What is, I think, crucial is how do you get that trust? Because people do not trust the promises. So I think you get the one good example is in Odisha, we have learned from some bad experiences and new experiences you have. I don't want to name companies because some companies do it well, others are trying to emulate them. But there are 2-3 examples where companies have front-ended their investment in the transition for the displaced people. So they've built a colony ahead of time with a school, with sanitation, and when they go with a package to the people to be displaced, they say, look, we're not just offering you a promise. Here is your house. The school is already functioning. This is a lump sum you're going to get, plus you're going to get an annuity. And provided a member of your family meets this minimum criterion, usually matriculation, we will give him or her a job. It's working. Tentatively, cautiously, hesitantly, but it is working. So I think this is not the only answer. There was references to the pooling that Andhra Pradesh is trying. There are references to a small portion of stock in any new venture to be given to the landowners so that they benefit in the long term. I think this competition between states is going to yield many different models in the coming months and coming years. And we should be open to trying out different models. And one of them may click as the most successful win-win model.
Over here, yes. There's the mic here. Rona Joy.
Rona Joy Sen, I'm with ISAS. I just want to ask you a brief question. Why do you think the BJP and Prime Minister Narendra Modi invested so much political capital on amending the act, the Land Acquisition Act, to which they were a party to, as you mentioned 30 months ago, instead of leaving it to the states as they've been sort of forced to do after the 6 months of intense debate, back and forth?
Simple, short answer is, I think, political miscalculation. I was surprised because in the initial months of this government, at similar forums, when I was asked what would be the priorities of the government, I had said it likely would not be land, because that would give immediately an emotive subject for a lot of opponents to rally around against the government. I think they could have, for example, look at the way they are tackling labor law. In my opinion, although it's a very crucial requirement, they are wisely not trying to ram it through parliament. In any case, they can't ram anything through because they don't have a majority in the upper house. So until the upper house numbers change, they will have to go through the normal political process of reaching out across the aisle, of having give and take, and agreeing on certain things to be passed and maybe give up on certain things. But for labor law, they are allowing some of the states, particularly the states governed by BJP, to take the lead. And they're hoping that it will have a demonstration effect. I know for a fact, one major European manufacturing company told me directly that they are doubling down their already existing investment in Rajasthan, and primarily because of the labor laws that Rajasthan is amending. And if this has a demonstration effect with other states which are trying to attract investment, then you could have sort of a bottom-up approach of making changes. Now, some things will have to be sold nationally and the lead will have to be taken by Parliament. But not all laws have to be led by Parliament. You can have, as in the US, you have a lot of federalism. Many states have different laws for different issues. I think it's not a bad thing. So the answer is, I think, as far as land was concerned, I think it was a political miscalculation of what should be prioritized.
Yes.
My name is Kala Sitaram Sridhar. I'm a professor at the Center for Research in Urban Affairs, Institute for Social and Economic Change in Bangalore. Your talk was fascinating. Thank you, Mr. Panda. And my question pertains not to resettlement, rehabilitation or compensation, but it pertains to urban land use. You did mention this interesting issue of manipulation of FARs, floor area ratios, and I will be speaking about this tomorrow, but I hope you know that Indian cities are draconian in their urban land use restrictions compared to cities internationally like Singapore, Shanghai, Hong Kong, New York and so forth. So I find that Odisha cities are also quite low on that thing, in the sense that the maximum FAR, floor area ratio permitted in Odisha cities, I found is 2. The maximum for any Indian city being like 4.25, right? That's Tamil Nadu, that's Chennai, I think. So what do you see the way forward? I hope that you know what are the benefits from relaxing these urban land use restrictions in India's cities. What do you think is the way forward for India cities and also for Odisha? Thank you.
I agree with you that urban land use laws are draconian. The problem is complex, and let me give you my perspective on it. First of all, we do not have the devolution of authority to our cities that we ought to have. The examples you gave, Shanghai and other places, the mayors and the city councils have real authority, real budgets to manage. We do not yet have that. The third tier, whether it is cities or panchayats, are handicapped because of lack of political devolution and fiscal devolution. So this is one of the roots of the problem. Now, the Byzantine rules regarding urban land use is partly because these other bottlenecks are choking it. Because, you know, if you don't have the people of the city elect somebody who is responsible to them and who can respond to these bottlenecks and change it, if it is at a state level always, because the decisions are made at the state level, irrespective of even where the laws allow a city to make changes. That's the bottleneck. But of course, there is rent-seeking behavior as well. One of the reasons you have so many Byzantine laws is that the more complexity you have, the more rents can be extracted out of giving clearances. So that needs to change. Now, in Odisha, if you come to Bhubaneswar, you'll see it's actually emerging as one of the better Indian cities. One of the few cities in India that have bicycle paths, proper sidewalks. Now, our concern is, I agree with you that FARs have to be bigger. But there are many other aspects that need to be sorted out. Firefighting capacity, electricity availability, things like that. So we are not in principle against it, but we want to have a step-by-step and proper holistic approach. But in most of India, you have all these problems, and I think we need to start with political and fiscal devolution to city authorities.
Yes.
Thank you very much. My name is Omkar Shrestha. Now I'm teaching at NUS Regional Economics. my question is slightly broader than just specific land issue, in the sense that without India's growth, the realization of 21st century as the Asian century is perhaps not possible. And without infrastructure, India's rise will be equally difficult. And without land, India's infrastructure, we know, is getting stuck, vis-a-vis especially China. Now, China is the first biggest Asian economy with a massive infrastructure. I have been there more than 100 times. I used to look after China when I was with the Asian Development Bank for over a decade. So I've seen that. And in India, the infrastructure is the major bottleneck and land is the major issue. Against that context, when India has such a fantastic regional and global issue to worry about, sometimes I wonder why Nepal, India gets stuck with small countries, neighboring countries, like denying the whole stock to Nepal for more than a month now, no cooking gas, no petroleum, no nothing. Why India doesn't concentrate on issues like this of regional importance and even more global importance? So that part, I'm a bit confused. Perhaps some light on that. Thank you.
Great question. Now, the difference, of course, between India and countries like China is that you need to build far bigger consensus. Now, you go back to 1980, China and India were approximately similar in terms of per capita income and so on and so forth. But in these past 35 years, the Chinese economy has become 5 times of the Indian economy, and infrastructure is a big part of what fueled that growth. If you look at studies from the World Bank and other agencies, we have been under-investing in infrastructure for a long time, and that's simply because of populism. We got complete universal adult franchise at one go, which no other democracy got. And so from day one, our policies have been populist. It's only in recent years that infrastructure has been catching up. Think about it. Go back 5-7 years, even though we had had 20 years of liberalization, we had some of the worst airports in the world. The first impression anybody got getting to India was horrible. That has changed. Today we have some very nice airports. So we change in spurts, but that consensus building is crucial to India. You can see that even today, when a finance minister has to speak on budget or ask Parliament for greater approval for infrastructure investment, the FM has to explain why growth is necessary. Now, we've already had 25 years of liberalization, and yet we actually have serious policymakers in India who challenge the primacy of growth. You heard what the Singaporean finance minister said, that you can't have growth without equity, and equally you can't have equity without growth. This simple mantra is yet to be fully accepted in India. I think we'll get there. We are getting there. Second part of your question, actually, if you step back and take a look, in the last year and a half, the Prime Minister has surprised everybody by the foreign policy outreach. And apart from the recent issues with Nepal, over the past 14-15 months, the relationship with Nepal actually improved dramatically. There are certain constraints in terms of agitations which are happening on the India-Nepal border, and I think that has somewhat stymied the government's approach. But I think the point that you made is being appreciated and is being attempted by the government in the outreach on foreign policy with special emphasis for South Asia, and then, of course, parallel emphasis for the rest of the world.
One second. Can I congratulate my friend from Nepal for electing the first woman president? Thank you, Prof, for asking the question. Yeah, please.
Good morning, sir. I'm Akhil and I'm a class 11 student at Global Indian International School. In your speech, you had mentioned that you want to modernize the laws in India so as to bring about both economic and social development in India. So can you please elaborate on this? And do you think modernization of laws would be the key solution in the long run?
Thank you.
Well, clearly a lot of laws need to be modernized because we have some truly obsolete laws going back a couple of hundred years. In fact, there is a list, I believe it is 287 obsolete laws that the government, laws on what is it? Lime whitewashing of factory sheds relevant to 19th century. So 287 laws have been identified for scrapping. But our laws need to be modernized for a variety of reasons. As I give the example of labor law. Now we need to create 1 million jobs a month. We are creating 1 million jobs a year. And we are disincentivizing. Today you have got the situation where a lot of investment has again started coming back into India. FDI, foreign direct investment, and other kinds of investment is beginning to rise again. Indian economy has turned the corner apparently. But this investment, when it goes to the ground, is seeking to avoid creating jobs. That is the dichotomy that we have. We must have a regulatory setup which incentivizes which investment that comes in to seek to create jobs, because you have to kill many birds with one stone. Creating jobs is one of the very crucial aspects of that. So unless we modernize labor laws, we are not, investment will always seek to avoid creating jobs. They don't want to deal with the headache of employment. So these are some of the tweaks that we have to fix.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Surya, you wanted to ask a question. I think this will have to be the last question.
Yeah, I'm Surya from the Institute of South Asian Studies. So you ended your speech on an optimistic note that perhaps within a decade things will be better on this particular front. What makes you think so? Is it because you expect some kind of new politics? You have partially hinted at the possibility of competitive federalism being a factor. Will there be something else in addition to that in terms of some kind of new politics? Or do you also expect some kind of new economics, say a shift away from so-called egalitarian approaches towards more market-oriented approaches? Thank you.
Thank you. That's a great question, particularly if it's the last question, because this is an aspect I did not get a chance to address in my talk. Now, I have been wrong before, but I think this time I might be right in being optimistic. 10 years ago, I was optimistic and I said that India has reached a trajectory where the automatic growth rate would be something like 7.5%, and it would take immense bungling to bring it down. But we managed to do that, and we brought it down. Now, we have again turned the corner. The competitive federalism is part of the reason I'm optimistic. Now, you're beginning to see, for example, two indices. Just day before yesterday, the World Bank issued its Ease of Doing Business Index. Last year, they had ranked India 142. They revised the rankings to make it 134 last year. Now, this year, they have said India is 130. So it's either a 12th place or a 4th place improvement, whichever way you look at it. Similarly, the World Economic Forum has an index called the Competitiveness Index of Nations. And last year, it had ranked India 71. This year, it has ranked India 55, which happened last month, earlier this month actually. So 16 place improvement. Final answer to your question is yes, indeed it is the competitive federalism and fiscal devolution that's going to be the answer. Let me give you an example. Now, over the past 30 years, we had created a plethora of central schemes, something like 300, where one size fits all. Take an example of something like Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan, which aims to provide funding for primary schools. And every state had the same cookie cutter option of accessing those funds. Take a state like Odisha. We've been doing well, but we still have only 73-74% literacy, compared to Kerala, which has something like 98% literacy. We have different requirements at the primary level. Our requirements at the primary level are very different than Kerala. A cookie cutter single solution does not work across the country. Now what is happening, something that some of us have been advocating for a long time is beginning to happen. On the economic front, the government is finally beginning to cede ground to the states. They're actually paring down some of the central programs which is being criticized, but this ought to be balanced by the states having more untied funds which they can decide what is their priority. Now, we have to see how that works out, but the principle is correct, that more funds should go to the state, let them decide if their priority is education or they want to spend more on health or they want to spend more on something else. That should be a state decision. You cannot, the states are the size of countries. In fact, some of the constituencies are the size of countries. My constituency is an average constituency. It's the size of Slovenia. It's the size of Estonia. In terms of, and Odisha is the size of England. So you cannot have the idea that India has to be run centrally. It has to go, and that is happening, which is why I'm hopeful. And some of the indices that I mentioned earlier, I think, are beginning to recognize this.
My colleague Jayant Singh has been kind enough to give us extra 5 minutes because he said you started late. So may I exercise the prerogative as moderator and ask a question which is unrelated directly to land, but I would very much like to hear Mr. Panda's views of what he thinks will happen in his neighboring state at the end, I think first 2 weeks of November, I think he will know the results. His prognosis of the election results would be very interesting. If you don't want to,
I can give you a great reason why I shouldn't. After the division of Bihar into Bihar and Jharkhand, Bihar is not our neighboring state anymore. But jokes aside, it's a crucial election, undoubtedly. You can see that there is a fever pitch. I don't want to hazard any guesses because the Indian public has a way of putting us all in our place if we presume to know what they are going to do. The problem, of course, is we have too many elections. And there have been a lot of talk about how do we streamline it to having perhaps 2 cycles of election during one general election, like the US has. They have a general election, then they have a midterm election. But in a parliamentary system, it poses challenges. In a Westminster model, it poses challenges to have that uniformity. But that's a bigger question. To come to Bihar, now clearly there is, I will only sort of state the issues as I say it, I will not make a prognosis. Clearly there is a fundamental political dialogue of a changing India that is at stake here. On the one hand, you have very traditional kind of election strategies of stitching together coalitions of different castes and different groups. On the other hand, you have an attempt to sell an idea of a different India, of a new India. Will that induce younger members of certain castes to say, look, we've had enough of this caste thing, we want to vote for on economic issues? That's a big question. Now, in the last 15 years, we have seen that attempts to have electioneering, campaigning based on economics or good governance has begun to work. In Bihar itself, Nitish Kumar ji won repeatedly. My chief minister, Naveen Patnaik, won 4 terms on that basis. This is a change from the narrative of the late 80s and the early 90s, which was much more about caste and very little about development and governance. Now, at a national level, Mr. Modi's election campaign was perhaps the first, arguably, the first pan-national campaign in modern India on the basis of development and governance. Perhaps the first time that the campaign wasn't, a national campaign was not about price of onions or border disputes with neighboring states, but about development as a whole. Now, we are again going back to a state which has had that narrative succeed in the last decade, and today it is anybody's guess. I think the Pandits have given it, they're calling it right down to the wire as to who will win. From what I can see, a month ago they were giving the BJP coalition a slight edge. Today they are saying maybe they don't have an edge. It's very hard to suss them out. Not all polls in India are legit. There are some polls which are conducted for disinformation and for campaign strategizing. Now, even if you take the better known polls and you try to do an average, like if you look at the US, you have something called Real Clear Politics, and they do an average poll of the polls. They'll take Gallup, they'll take Nielsen, they'll take 2-3 others, they'll take an average. If you take that average, it's coming touch and go. So I would hesitate to comment, but I'll give you one last answer. If you look at the trend of such polls over the last decade, whoever they have said is doing well, but perhaps not so well, has actually gone on to do extremely well. For example, 2 elections ago in UP, they said that the BSP would do very well, but would not have a majority. But the BSP got a majority. In the last UP election, they said that the Samajwadi Party would do very well but would not have a majority. They got a majority. In the national election last year, they said the BJP would be the single largest but would not have a majority. But actually it got a majority. So if you take that trend, I will leave it to you to draw conclusions as to who the polls are actually indicating will maybe or may not just make it. Perhaps they will actually go across the line.
Thank you, Mr. Panda. And thank you for agreeing to answer the question. I think we have run out of time. I think I'll have to call this, this interaction to an end, bring it to an end. And I would like to present Mr. Panda with a small gift from ISAS. It's only a number of books.